Well, this morning we continue our series entitled Ordinary People. And our focus has been on the very early movement of the early church, when Christianity really began to enter into the reality in which we are living here today. That people were dedicating and living their lives to following Jesus. And what we begin seeing happening is not only are their lives transformed as they live for Him day by day, but there is a tremendous impact upon the communities in which they live. And as I look at the early church and I look at the way in which it has continued to grow and continue to develop, I think one of the realities we see is how, because of the way in which they followed Jesus, they were becoming contagious. I thought about that word this week and thought maybe it's not the best use of the word, considering the time of season we're entering into with flu and with colds being handed back and forth. But this movement of Jesus, this vision of an other way of living, this other type of kingdom orientation, was something that is not simply taught, something that is not simply learned, but rather it is a vision that is caught. A new way, a new reality that we begin to orient our lives in that direction. And this morning I included a quote in the very beginning of the bulletin, and it comes from the 2nd century. There's some dispute over when exactly it was written, approximately about 140 years after Jesus' death, or 170 years after the end of the book, after the book of Acts was written. But what we see here is how this movement of Christ followers that began as 120 was beginning to impact the entire Roman Empire. And what this letter is it's a letter written by a Christian to a non-believer, a high-ranking Roman officer. The term of the day was a pagan, wanting to know what is going on. I see these things that are taking place, and I want to know a little bit more. And what I've included is just a little bit of an excerpt of the letter that was written. They called it an epistle back then. And what we start seeing is the reality of how the core teachings of Jesus were being lived out in a real practical way. I just want to walk us through it a little bit here this morning as we see exactly what was happening. As the letter begins, Christians are not distinguished from the rest of humanity by country, language, or custom. They marry like everyone else and have children, but they do not expose their offspring. You see, in the Greco-Roman world at the time, it was acceptable for fathers to take the lives of their children, particularly daughters. The lives were not, depending upon who you were and what level of rank you had, were not viewed as valuable. And Christians in the midst of this were saying, no, we value every life regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of social status, regardless of gender. We value life. Goes on to say they share their food but not their wives. Again, in that day, sex was viewed as an appetite. And in the same way that when we're hungry, you kind of go to the fridge and you open it up and say, okay, what am I going to eat? I'm going to satisfy this appetite. In the same way, that is how sex was viewed, that they had a very liberal view of people's sex lives, that if you felt lust, if you felt turned on, then absolutely feed that appetite. So they were very open with their beds, but incredibly tight-fisted with their stuff. So what did Christians say? We are incredibly tight-fisted with our beds. That we believe this is a gift given to us by God as a marker of commitment bound to marriage. But we will be completely open and generous with our stuff. Have at it. And people would look at that and think, there's something else going on here. And then finally it says, they love everyone, but by everyone they are persecuted. That seems very familiar to a teaching of Jesus, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. 140 years after Jesus walked the earth physically, the reality of his life was being lived out in his followers. And then finally it says, they are poor, yet they make many rich. And that's kind of where we're going to land here this morning. looking at another ordinary individual, a guy by the name of Barnabas, and the impact that he had upon a community of people, and the impact that this community then had upon another community. We begin to see how the way of Jesus, when we follow his teaching, becomes contagious. People catch it and pass it on. So this morning we're turning to an account in Acts chapter 11. And the context is the early church has been persecuted primarily through the death of Stephen in Jerusalem. You may remember a couple of weeks ago we looked at that. And as a result, the Christians are now having to scatter. They're now having to leave Jerusalem and to go into other regions. And we start to see how a negative got turned into a positive, because now these little pockets of Christ followers is starting to pop up. And there's one particular community north of Jerusalem called Antioch. And that's where we're going to land here this morning. Acts chapter 11, verse 19. It says, "Now those who had been scattered by the persecution in connection with Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, telling the message only to Jews. Some of them, however, men from Cyprus and Cyrene, went to Antioch and began to speak to Greeks, also telling them the good news of Jesus. The Lord's hand was with them, and a great number of people believed and turned to the Lord. News of this reached to the ears of the church at Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. When he arrived and saw the evidence of the grace of God, he was glad and encouraged them all to remain true to the Lord with all their hearts. He was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. Then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. So for a full year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. During this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. This happened during the reign of Claudius. The disciples, each according to their ability, decided to provide help for the brothers living in Judea. This they did, sending their gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. So what we see happening is as a result of the persecution, these Christ communities are beginning to pop up. And something so significant was happening in Antioch that where it all began in Jerusalem, where the primary leaders, the apostles, were still living, heard of this news and said, we want to hear more. We want to have firsthand knowledge. So they sent Barnabas to go and to hang out with them and to see what was happening. Now, we're not told a lot about what exactly went on, but there's an interesting line that can't be thrown away when we're told that Barnabas went to encourage them to remain true to the Lord with their whole heart. Now, what does that mean? What does that look like, to remain true to the Lord with your whole heart? I mean, is that something that we can really ponder upon, or is it a little bit like Jell-O that you try to grasp and just kind of squeezes through your fingers, and you want to say, what does this practically look like? What does this look like for them? What does this look like for me to remain true to the Lord with my whole heart? I think we're given a bit of a window, a glimpse into what part of that reality was. Because immediately after that, we're told that Barnabas and Saul spend another year with them, and that then word comes that a severe famine is about to hit Jerusalem. And we're told the followers of Jesus in Antioch decided to give, each according to their own ability, to help those people in need. We begin to see one of the realities of submitting to Christ with your whole heart is a characteristic of generosity. Now, you could read that and think, wow, the church of Antioch was incredibly generous. I wonder where they got that from. What's interesting is Acts 11 is not the first time we're introduced to Barnabas. But if you go all the way back to the book of Acts chapter 4, The very first time we're introduced to Barnabas is at the very beginning of the early church and its movement. And what was happening was as more and more people, primarily from means of poverty and low income and not having much money, were catching this vision of this different type of kingdom, this new way of life. They were wanting to follow Jesus. And the apostles were looking around and thinking, hey, it is wonderful that we're telling them the good news of Jesus, but they have material and physical needs as well. What are we going to do? So a practice developed that was not forced, it was not coerced, but people who had means began selling their possessions, selling their homes, selling their fields, and bringing the money to the apostles so that it could be used to help those in greater need. Take a wild guess. Who do you think was the one example that was given in Acts 4 as someone doing this? This is not a rhetorical question. Barnabas. There we go. Barnabas was the example. He had a field, he sold the field, and he brought the money to the apostles. And as you read through the book of Acts, you see one of the realities of Barnabas was he was an incredibly generous guy, not only with his stuff, but with his time, with his people. And now he shows up in Antioch, and suddenly a need arises in Antioch, and I don't think it's a coincidence that suddenly they became generous with their stuff as well. You see, Barnabas caught the vision of Jesus. He passed it on to Antioch. They passed it on. And we begin to see how this movement is not about simply learning more about Jesus. It's about catching his vision. It's about understanding that he calls us to live life in a different way. That Jesus came to offer them the abundant life, a different way of living. So what does this mean for us? You know, one of the delicate and tricky conversations we always have in any walk of life, but particularly in a church, is conversations about our possessions, conversations about our stuff. And we can sit here and we can talk about the importance of, generosity in all aspects of life, but we can't sidestep this issue of dealing with our possessions. Because this was a reality of the early church. This was one of the, I believe, core teachings of Jesus. When you look through the teachings of Jesus, the thing that Jesus spoke most about was the kingdom of God, about living life with God. Very close next to it was Jesus' discussion regarding possessions. And you have to begin to ask, can we really sidestep this issue if it was so of such primary importance to him? Two things I want you just to consider here this morning that I have been kind of rattling around in my mind, because oftentimes what people say is, well, you know what? The New Testament doesn't really talk about amount, which sometimes we think maybe a get-out-of-jail-free card, but I think it's actually a higher calling, because in the Old Testament, they talked a lot about amounts. When they talked about giving to God, they would talk about a tithe, they would talk about offerings, they would talk about 10%, and you could kind of get yourself off the hook and say, got my 10%, got my offering, and I'm sorted, right? Everything else is mine. And then in the New Testament, there's this language of give generously, but we're never told how much they actually gave. And sometimes I would like to know a little bit about how much they gave. Like what is the marker? What is the standard we're called to give? And in this story in Antioch, we're not even told. We're told each gave according to their own ability. Thanks, Jesus. Thanks for letting me having to wrestle with this for the rest of my life. But that's what we begin seeing in the New Testament. And every time that Jesus talked about possessions, he nuanced it in such an incredible way. I'm just going to walk you through 3 different conversations Jesus had with different people in different walks of life regarding their possessions. And you begin to see you can't nail Jesus down on a number. It begins to hit at something even more significant. I'm just going to go through it quickly, so I'll give you the references, and if you want to do some more follow-up reading this week, you can. But the first conversation happens in Luke chapter 18. when a rich young ruler comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? I mean, what a great question, right? This guy just nailed it early on and says, okay, let's hear the answer. I've got my note and my payphone out. Jesus, what's the answer? What must I do? And Jesus is like, well, you know the commandments. Just follow those. And the rich young ruler's like, awesome. I have followed all the laws and the commands since I was a young boy. And Jesus is like, that is great. Oh, just one more thing. Go home, sell everything you got, give it to the poor, and then come hang out with me. And the rich young ruler is like, oh, you got to be kidding. I have a lot of stuff. That is a big sale. And we're told he goes away sad. And his disciples are like, Jesus, what is going on here? Can anyone enter the kingdom of God? And Jesus is like, it's going to be hard, especially for those rich people. But here's the good news. What's impossible with people, God can sort out. Jump ahead another chapter and you think, well, wait a second here. Is Jesus telling me that I need to sell everything I have? That you begin to see how to remain true to the Lord with our whole heart doesn't mean just simply following the rules. It's about this attitude of our possessions. And I got to give you everything? Luke 19, Jesus is now walking into a city called Jericho. And there's this short man named Zacchaeus who's a chief tax collector, which is a polite way of saying he became rich and wealthy by ripping off people all of the time. He stole from them, he collected taxes from them, and he just gathered and accumulated and accumulated. But he hears this news of Jesus. I mean, this vision is being caught. So he hangs out in a tree and sees Jesus, and Jesus sees him, and they interact, and Jesus then goes into his home and has lunch with him, and Zacchaeus' life is changed. It says, this is the life I want. I am going to pay back 4 times the amount of anyone I've ripped off, and then whatever is remaining, I am going to give half to the poor. And Jesus says, today salvation has come to you. Well, I'm sorry, if I'm the rich young ruler, I'm like, you know what, that's real generous about Zacchaeus giving half, but I was asked to give all of it away. What is that about? And the disciples are like, so what? What are we supposed to give? Jump ahead 2 more chapters, it gets even more nuanced. Jesus is now sitting in Luke 21. Jesus is sitting outside the temple where the treasury was, where people would drop off their givings and their offerings. And people are coming and they're dropping in great amounts, and Jesus is sitting there and probably looking kind of just unimpressed with what's going on. And then suddenly this poor old widow kind of shows up, and probably very unassuming, and she goes and drops in like 2 coins, which in our day's economy would have been less than like a fraction of a penny. She drops it in, and Jesus turns to his disciples and says, she gave more than anybody else. Hey, Jesus, what is your economy here? You asked a rich guy to give everything away, which would have been a lot of money. Zacchaeus gave half of it away, which is pretty good. And she gives such a fraction that wouldn't even tip the budget in one way or the other, yet you make a big stink out of that. And Jesus is like, that is what my kingdom is about. You see, the kingdom of this world tells us to accumulate, tells us to gather, tells us to give a little bit, because that's good charity, that's good practice. But we need to find our security, and sometimes we find our identity in our stuff. And maybe the more we have, the more secure we feel, or the more we have, the more we think we need to have. And Jesus is like, no, I want you to walk by a different rule of life. I have a different view of wealth, of possessions. I want you to actually give it away as a means to show that you find your identity in me. You find your security in me. You see, Jesus says it's not about the amount you give. It's not even about the fact that your giving is going to help other people, which is so important and so incredible. Jesus says the root reason that I ask you to give is so that I can have your heart, so that I can have all of your life. But there's a second thing that I notice as I look at the early church. And maybe you've picked up on this as you read through the book of Acts or you read through the Gospels, is that there is an incredible amount of detail and time given to the casting out of demons, to the healing of people who are possessed by evil spirits. And a question I have been asked throughout this series and at different times is why does it seem that in the Western world, in Canada, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of evil spirits or of casting out demons, that seems to be more prevalent in the New Testament times and even more prevalent in more impoverished areas of the world. What is going on here? And the more I thought about it and tried to come up with understanding and reasoning, I've kind of landed on this one. You see, evil spirits is a tactic of Satan to prevent people from fully living life with God. So that when Jesus would come, he would free them from the demon, he'd free them from the evil spirit, and suddenly there was this freedom. They were no longer bound and need to be chained down, and it was just an awful state to see someone possessed by an evil spirit. Yet, that doesn't seem to be the reality in our world. And the reason I believe is that Satan has found a much more subtle, destructive, and efficient tactic to drawing us away from God. Our possessions, our stuff. One of the great dangers we need to be aware of, one of the great pulls we have in our lives is that we begin to become possessed by our possessions. I mean, think of how tightly we want to hold on to it, and we're not ready to free it. And I begin to see that maybe why Jesus speaks into this so often in our lives is because he knows the stronghold it can have. I don't know about you, but I know the stronghold it has in my life. This aspect of just how do we respond? How do we deal with it in the midst of life? How do we begin to catch this vision so that our perspective is changed? So that we too, like the early church, remain true to Jesus with our entire hearts. I had someone share this example with me a while ago, and it's an example I'm going to share with you, and out of it I'm going to share two practical steps that I have taken to help me kind of view my possessions, view my stuff in a different way, so that I begin to detach myself from this kingdom and align myself with Jesus. Imagine, if you can, that you are homeless, that you're without a place to stay. And I show up to you one day and say, I want to come and show you something. And I walk you down this street and you're kind of wondering, okay, where am I going? What are you doing? And I walk you up to this beautiful home. And I open the door and I hand you the keys and I say, this is now yours. And you're like, what? I didn't buy it. I didn't pay it. I didn't do anything for it. I'm like, I know exactly. It's a gift. I'm going to give this to you. It's fully furnished. The fridge is stocked. Everything is yours. And you're stuck. You're like, wow, is there a catch? No. Here's the deed. Here's the mortgage. It's all sorted out. Enjoy your home. And you walk into this home and you're just absolutely flabbergasted. You think, this is amazing. What a tremendous gift. Joel, what a great guy. And a few days pass, and a few weeks pass, and a few months pass, and maybe even a few years pass, and you become more comfortable in this, and you enjoy it and everything. And then one day I show up at your door, kind of unannounced, and I say, how are things going? How's life been treating you? Everything's going well. And I say, just something for you to consider. Would you mind if I moved in with you? I'm not asking for the house back. I just want to stay in a room. You can choose the room. You can furnish the room. Can I live with you? Just in one room. Probably 3 responses you can give. Absolutely not. This is my house. You gave it to me. I don't want you living with me. Absolutely not. I'm going to assume we're probably not going to land in option 1. Option number 2 is, oh yeah, you gave me this house, the beautiful house. It's probably the right thing to do. I feel a little guilty about it if I don't do it. So, yeah, bring your stuff in. You can have the den. Option number 3. You come to the reminder and the realization that, you know what, we have been enjoying this house. We have been loving this house. We would be honored to have you come and hang out with us. This is such a great opportunity for us to say thank you to you for what you have done for me. You see, that is the perspective I begin to look at life with. That if I honestly view life as a gift given to me by God, that there are so many things that are beyond my control. The country and the family I've been born into, the era I live in, the opportunities and the resources that I have been given, the way in which God continues to bless me and bless me and bless me. It's as if Jesus says, I have given you this life. Can I live with you? Can I have a portion of what I have already given to you? And what I begin to realize is that when I look at life in that way, I don't want to confine Jesus to just a room, to just a percentage of my house. I want to open it up and say, Jesus, you have full access to my house. Come and watch TV. Come and eat out of my fridge. Come and use my golf clubs. Come and drive my car. Come and use my hockey gear. Whatever you need to do, just this is mine, this is yours. And it's a little scary because when you confine someone to a room, you can call them on it when they step out of their room. But if you open up your house to them, suddenly you're giving them free run of your stuff. And that is scary. So 2 practical things that I begin to do with this new perspective. The one is I see the importance of giving Jesus specific room in my life. I call that regular giving to his ministries, to his church, to the different things that are happening, because it acts as a reminder that everything else I am a manager of. That I give a percentage so that I am reminded of this wonderful gift that God has given to me. But the second thing I do is I try to open the doors to all the other rooms. To view my possessions not as mine, but as things that God has given me so that I can manage his stuff. So that I can be free to allow others to use the things that he has given to me. And what I begin to see happening is an incredible dynamic. Because where we are today in our giving is not where we were 10 years ago. And I don't think is where we are going to be 10 years down the road. It's not an equation to be figured out. It's not a bottom line to be given. It's a reality of seeing, Jesus, what are you speaking into my life here this day? Am I managing the things you have given to me? So what's our next step? For some, you may be sitting there thinking, I don't agree with this. This doesn't make sense. And remember, it's a vision to be caught. It's not something where you're told and you're demanded and you're explained. In every situation that Jesus encountered people, he never walked them down and says, you must. The rich young ruler, he said, give it all away. And the rich young ruler said, I can't do that, and he walked away. Jesus never told Zacchaeus to give half of it away. Jesus never walked up to the old woman and prompted her to give her 2 coins away. You see, when a vision is caught, it suddenly becomes a reality of who you are. So in all of life, the more we pursue Jesus, the more we catch this greater reality of the life he truly offers. The second place we may be is, you know what, I agree with that and I want that, but practically, I don't know how to get there. I encourage you to take that next step. You see, the church in Antioch all gave according to their own ability. Allow God to speak into your own life and to see what is it that I want to free up in you so that you can truly experience the abundance that I offer. One of the most important lessons that I have learned in life is the less possessive I am of my possessions, the more generous I am in all of life. The more generous I am with my time, the more generous I am with people. But it all begins with that root cause of giving my possessions back to the possessor of my soul, Jesus Christ. I invite you to please stand with me as we sing together.